to what Adam Smith called free circulation of labor, free movement of people, which is the foundation of free trade. Adam Smith, at least, but not for the successors today. By other measures, globalization has increased, is now much higher than a century ago, most dramatically in the flow of short-term speculative capital, which is far beyond any historical precedent. These differences, they reflect the central features of contemporary version of globalization. Capital has priority. What happens to people is incidental. Particular effort to harm them doesn't matter very much. There are some more technical measures of globalization, and one technical measure, standard one, is convergence to a global market. Would lead to that if getting globalization. So a single price and wage internationally. Well, that certainly hasn't happened. With regard to incomes, quite the opposite has happened. In fact, inequality has soared, and that's expected to continue. The U.S. intelligence community, with participation of specialists from the academic professions and the private sector, has just released a long report on its expectations for the year 2015. And it lays out several scenarios. The most optimistic one, they say, is that globalization will proceed on course and its evolution will be rocky, marked by chronic financial volatility and a widening economic divide. That is, less convergence in the technical sense, less globalization in the technical sense, but more globalization in the doctrinally preferred sense, meaning the rich get richer. Financial volatility that they predict means slower growth and more crises and more bailout. Since World War II, if you look at the resumption of globalization, it's gone through two phases. The first phase is the Bretton Woods era up to the mid-1970s. The second phase is the period since, with the dismantling of the Bretton Woods system of regulated exchange rates and controls on capital movement. The second phase is what's usually called globalization. It's associated with neoliberal policies, and it's called the Washington Consensus. Well, the two phases are quite different. Economists commonly describe the first phase as the golden age of capitalism. The second phase is often called the leaden phase. The reason is that in the second phase, the globalization phase, there was a marked deterioration in standard macroeconomic measures that includes rate of growth of the economy, productivity, capital investment, world trade, much higher interest rates, harming economies, increased financial volatility, and in fact a whole range of other harmful consequences. Many prominent international economists regard the liberalization of capital, which led to an astronomical increase in short-term speculative capital, as a substantial factor in the poor outcomes of phase two, globalization phase. Well, so little is understood about the international economy that one has to be rather cautious about causal connections. But one consequence of the liberalization of capital is fairly clear. It undercuts democracy, well understood. That was understood by the framers of the Bretton Woods system back in 1944. One reason why, explicit reason why they founded, Britain and the United States founded the Bretton Woods system on the regulation of capital, was to allow governments to carry out social democratic policies, called welfare state policies, which had enormous popular support around the world, including the United States. It's understood, they understood, and obvious that free capital movement yields what some economists call a virtual parliament, which has veto power over government decision, sharply restricting democratic options. Governments face what's called a dual constituency conundrum, namely voters, one constituency, speculators, another one. The second constituency conduct moment-by-moment referendums on government policies, looking at technical study of the contemporary financial system. And even in the rich countries, the private constituency prevails, overwhelmingly so in the poor countries. This attack on democracy, planned attack on democracy, is a very significant element of phase two, globalization phase. And other components of the Washington Consensus are designed to lead to the same ends. So consciously, openly, socioeconomic decisions are increasingly shifted to unaccountable concentrations of power. That's an essential feature of the neoliberal reform. Although I should add that the masters make quite sure to sustain the nanny state for the rich and the privileged, and to socialize costs and risks. It's understood. Now, a common claim is that globalization, the second phase, has led to remarkable prosperity. The truth is quite different, not controversial. There were some who benefited greatly, including those who tell everyone else the wonderful news. But the record is in fact dismal in every region of the world, apart from countries that did not follow the rules, primarily Asian countries, countries that rejected the religion that markets know best, quoting the chief economist of the World Bank, for a time at least. In contrast, the neoliberal regime was imposed with most rigor in Latin America. The director of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean has just reported to the American Economics Association that, in his words, the promised land is a mirage. Growth in the 1990s was far below that of the 3 decades of state-led development from the 1950s to the 1970s. It's correlation which holds worldwide, he points out. And the conclusion is confirmed in a recent study by the Inter-American Development Bank, which attributes more than half of the difference between Latin America and the developed societies to the weak states in Latin America. Well, consider the richest country in the world, us. During phase 1, Second World War up to approximately the mid-70s, average wages rose about 75%, and quite across the board, in fact. Like the lowest 20% gained more than the highest 20%. That's phase 1. In phase 2, average wages have actually declined. Now, the recent growth spurt of the last couple of years brought them back up to the level of 1968, the level of 1903. Male median wages are still below 1989. It's the peak of the last business cycle, well below the 1970s. Middle-income families are now putting in approximately a month extra of work a year just to try to keep things stagnant. It's the highest workload in the industrial countries, U.S., Japan. Growth, such as it is, has been driven mainly by consumer demand. That, in turn, is driven by massive propaganda called advertising. One result is that household debt has soared. Last year it was greater than disposable income, I think for the first time in American history. Stocks are the source of most of the new wealth. 1% of the population holds close to half the stocks. Poverty is greater than it was 20 years ago. Among the industrial countries, the United States and Britain are by far the worst in this respect. They're also the 2 countries with the most loyalty to the Washington Consensus. If you look at social indicators, quality of life indicators, they tracked economic growth up into the mid-70s, right through the golden age. At that point, the 2 curves separated. Social indicators started to drop. They're now back in absolute terms, they're now back at the level of about 40 years ago. Well, this picture generalizes. There's variation, of course. The picture actually becomes much worse if you depart from standard macroeconomic measures, which have a very high ideological component in what they choose to measure. Remember that. There are plenty of illustrations. So take one. Just recently, the International Labor Organization reported a rising worldwide epidemic of serious mental health disorders, often linked to stress in the workplace, with very substantial fiscal costs, billions of dollars in Europe and North America. A large factor, they say, is economic globalization, which brings evaporation of job security, pressure on workers, and a higher workload, particularly in the United States. Well, is that a cost of globalization? Depends what stand you take. From one point of view, which happens to be the overwhelmingly dominant one, is one of the great things about globalization, one of its most attractive features. So, for example, Alan Greenspan, when he lauds the current U.S. economic performance as what he calls extraordinary. He points out that a major factor, I'm quoting, is a heightened sense of job insecurity and as a consequence, subdued wages. As anyone who's taken an economics course knows, that helps the economy. The World Bank agrees. It recognizes that labor market flexibility has acquired a bad name as a euphemism for pushing wages down and workers out, but nonetheless, increasing labor market flexibility is essential in all parts of the world. The most important reforms involve lifting constraints on labor mobility and wage flexibility, as well as breaking the ties between social services and labor contracts. So in brief, the most important reforms entail pushing workers out and pushing wages down and undermining social services, all contributions to the health of the economy, according to prevailing ideology. Unregulated trade has further benefits for corporations. I mentioned corporations. Most trade I mentioned before is centrally managed, gives all kind of ways of avoiding market discipline. The broad trading areas also benefit corporations by making them much less answerable to local and national communities. That enhances the effects of the neoliberal programs, which have consistently reduced the labor share of income. In the United States, the 1990s was the first post-war period when the division of income shifted strongly to owners of capital away from labor. And trade has a wide variety of costs that are unmeasured under prevailing ideology, though they're real. So, for example, the costs of subsidizing energy and resource depletion and other so-called externalities. Actually, one of the great advantages of trade is supposed to be that it increases specialization. Everyone studied this in school. Great things about trade. Increasing specialization reduces choices, including the choice to modify comparative advantage. It's called development, in other words. Now, the choice and development are values in themselves. The undermining by pursuing comparative advantage is a huge cost, but it's uncounted. Just suppose the American colonies, let's say, had been compelled to pursue the contemporary regime 200 years ago. Well, New England would be exporting fish. It certainly wouldn't be producing textiles. The textile industry survived only because of exorbitant tariffs to bar British products. Same with steel and other industries right up to the present. That was particularly true in the highly protectionist Reagan years, in which markets were virtually closed to try to save U.S.-based corporations. Well, there's a lot more to say about this, but a lot of it's masked in selective modes of economic measurement. Interesting topic that somebody might want to pursue is that the harm that's caused by pursuing comparative advantage is in fact something that was pointed out by Adam Smith in another connection, namely with regard to division of labor. It's basically the same point. He harshly condemned division of labor, afraid of what you learn, because it, as he pointed out, it leads to specialization and turns people into the most stupid and ignorant creatures that can possibly be, unless the government somehow intervenes to prevent it, as should happen in any civilized society. The generalization of that to the international scene applies to the specialization that's supposed to be one of the great advantages of trade. Well, these are just things that aren't counted. In fact, well, let me just end by, let me do one more point about things that aren't measured, which are, so take there are some standard assumptions which you really look at very carefully. So, for example, the U.S. record is constantly put forth as proof that flexible labor markets lead to, and low wages and benefits increase employment. That's taken for granted, and it's kind of plausible. But have a look at the evidence. When you look at the evidence, you get quite a different picture. Actually, it was one study that I know of in the American Journal of Sociology last year. They asked the obvious question: what happens if we add to the labor market the people who are taken out of it by the U.S. form of labor market interference, namely toss them in jail? Okay. when you throw people in jail, mostly working class males, females, that takes them out of the labor market. Furthermore, so what happens if you just count them in? Well, it turns out if you count them in, but the United States unemployment level is approximately like Europe. And in fact, if you made a realistic count and you added in incarceration rates, of course, are way beyond Europe. That's since the neoliberal period began in 1980. Before then, it was about the same. If you add in, you do it more realistically, you should also be counting the enormous, what we call employment, that should be called negative employment or harmful employment, namely everything that's involved in keeping them there. Guards, services, construction, and so on. Take that into account, the U.S. unemployment rates are way above Europe. So the question comes down to what form of labor market interference do you want? Do you want the kind which, say, unemployment insurance or retraining programs or something? That's the kind that was supposed to be bad. Or do you want the kind that's supposed to be good, namely our kind, throw them in jail? So that's a choice. It's not a question of economics. It's a question of value. Interesting that it's not raised. Let me end by quickly just saying a couple words about the history of development, which is very clear and very formative. So in the 18th century, wealth differences between the richest and poorest countries were not very great. They rose steadily. They're now enormous. In many respects, in the 18th century, China and India in particular were at least as advanced as England. I won't bother with details. Over the centuries, that has changed, and it's changed for very well understood reasons. The change corresponds, the effects correspond very closely to sovereignty. Countries that were able to maintain their sovereignty were able to develop. Countries that lost their sovereignty were either remained poor or were made poor. That's very clear correlation and very well known. Take one case, the difference in industrial development between India and Japan, I'm quoting well-known economic historians, simply illustrates the difference in the direction and emphasis between a country running its own affairs and a dependency whose affairs were being managed by an external power. In fact, it wasn't until independence that India resumed the course that had been blocked by centuries of colonization. Quite generally, just take a look, the countries that were conquered or otherwise subdued were unable to develop. And also those countries were what some economic historians call an ocean of liberalism. That is, they had free trade regime forced on them, and it destroyed them. Meanwhile, the countries that have become rich, starting from England, including the United States up to the East Asian ones, all of them, without exception, radically violated the principles that are imposed on the poor. Something to look at. Maybe, I said, international economies are not very well understood, but this correlation is so dramatic, and the reasons seem so obvious that it ought to be a primary area of concern. So, I'll talk more about it, but too long already. So let me just summarize. Sovereignty has many dimensions. It raises a lot of problems. They're not easy ones. There's a history which is revealing, should not be forgotten. There are points of logic and there are moral truisms that shouldn't be ignored. There are important questions of fact, too, which merit close attention. We should try at least to adopt the stance of the neutral observer who compares professed values with real-world practice, a stance that shouldn't be all that hard for us to adopt because we do so reflexively with regard to official enemies. The trick is to do it for yourself. And however difficult that may be, we should at least recognize the importance of trying to approach that ideal rather than succumbing to doctrinal convention that present us in a favorable light, but that do not resist scrutiny and analysis that's keeping to a traditional practice should be examined without illusions. apologies for going on too long, but bad habit.
We'll go for about 10 minutes with questions, and then everybody, as I hope you know, is invited to present from the questions. You'll do?
Way back, and we'll come forward.
Professor Chomsky, thanks for that, and thanks for the school for organizing this. I've got a question going back to the first part of your talk, maybe a little off the subject, in which case I apologize. Yesterday in The Hague, there was a conviction of a Bosnian Serb militiaman for crimes against humanity. In this case, you might know a set of fairly egregious facts relating to the rape, detention, and ultimate sale for 100 Deutschmarks of a 12-year-old Bosnian Muslim girl. This was part of an initiative to sort of create a system of international justice that's been going on for some years now. I just wanted to get your opinion about it, because I know your sometimes co-author, Ed Herman, has sometimes written fairly scathingly about the Yugoslav Tribunal and the selectivity of international justice, but I'm thinking about it from the point of view of a permanent international criminal court, which is going to likely come into effect in about 2-3 years' time, and which certainly the Pentagon and the State Department feel is a matter of serious concern to them from the point of view of their ability to use force in pursuance of American foreign policy goals internationally. So I just wanted to get your view on that.
Well, look, I mean, it's the same question as intervention. There's two separate questions. One, are these particular people guilty of great crimes? Answer that, yeah, probably so. Second, is there any justice being pursued? Answer that flatly, no. And we see that right off. I mean, comparable, the crimes, you take a look at the people who are subjected to crimes, they're the defeated victims. Those who win and are powerful are immune, okay? Actually, same was true at Nuremberg. You get asked the same question. Here's the people who committed the worst crimes in human history. They were tried, hanged, that's just. But what about the tribunal itself? Well, you take a look at the War Crimes Tribunal at Nuremberg. They had to define war crime somehow. And they had a definition. It was pretty explicit, in fact. Like Telford Taylor, prosecutor, describes it explicitly. The operative definition of war crime was a crime that we could show that they committed and we didn't. Okay? So, for example, massive bombing of civilian targets was not a war crime, because the U.S. and Britain did it more than they did, so that wasn't a war crime. In fact, Nazi war criminals were able to present as a defense, and it was accepted that the West had done the same thing. That's not a war crime. And in fact, if we used the principles that were presented at Nuremberg, the whole U.S. elite would have been jail or worse, if you believe in the death penalty, for a long time, ever since. In fact, hard to imagine an American president it wouldn't be. In fact, let's just take the present situation. Let's take one of the minor footnotes, not the major crimes. One of them, and let me just ask you a question. Suppose that Osama bin Laden was able to blow up and destroy half the pharmaceutical production in the United States. Would that be a problem? Like, would we think something ought to be done about it? Yeah, we'd sort of nuke the world. You know? But what happens when the United States does that to a poor African country, destroying half of its pharmaceutical supplies? Notice that's a much worse crime, because destroying half the pharmaceutical supplies in the United States, might not have that big an effect. They have plenty of capacity to produce them again. It's not true when you destroy half the pharmaceutical supplies in Sudan. But is that a crime? Like, do you see anybody on trial? Do you even see an inquiry? Like, the government did request an inquiry at the United Nations, but the U.S. immediately blocked it. And the educated intellectual folks like us didn't raise a peep. That's the prerogatives of power. And exactly the same is true in the Yugoslav case. So yes, there are people who've been condemned for crimes. Actually, one of the first ones was a Serbian officer, what rank, who was tried because he fired missiles armed with cluster bombs at a populated area. This was in reaction to the largest single act of ethnic cleansing that took place there, the U.S.-backed Croatian offensive, which drove a couple 100,000 people out of Krajina. In reaction to that atrocity, he shot a missile with cluster bombs at a populated area. Well, that's a crime. I don't have any objection to that. But can you think of anyone else who's used missiles with cluster bombs in that area? Think of people. In fact, the whole place is littered with unexploded cluster bombs that the U.S. won't even help get rid of. Okay, and Herman can speak for himself, but we have to make exactly the same distinction as before, as in the case of intervention. Is the action in itself legitimate? Maybe so, maybe not. The case. Does it have anything to do with justice? Just more pure hypocrisy. A way for the rich and powerful to do what they want to the weak and defenseless. Sometimes correct. Like sometimes they really are. We should be able to face that. I mean, at the point when we're willing to apply the standards to ourselves, at that point we can begin raising questions of justice, not before. Major obstacles, putting it mildly, refuse to allow it. I mean, yeah, but it's kind of one interesting aspect of this whole talk about, the big thesis that you hear over and over again is that this great new era we're entering is one in which sovereignty is recognized to be less important than other considerations. Now one of the other paradoxes about this is that it's recognized at the same time that the leader of this crusade, namely us, is raising the demand for its own sovereignty to previously unheard peaks. In fact, that's the refusal to accept criminal court judgment as one aspect of it. I mean, this has been so massive that it's even gotten a name. It's called the New Sovereigntism. There was an article in Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, pointing out that the U.S. has a new doctrine, the New Sovereigntism, namely U.S. sovereignty overrides everything. No matter what anybody thinks about anything. Do what you want. Well, somehow the fact that the new sovereigntism is rampant on the part of the leader of the enlightened states doesn't contradict or lead to any problems in the fact that the same country is leading us into a new era in which sovereignty doesn't matter anymore. I try to reconcile those two thoughts in your mind. Actually, there's an easy answer. It's the usual answer. The rich and powerful do what they feel like. And what they feel like is right by definition. And the intellectual classes applaud because that's their responsibility. That goes way back in history, nothing particularly novel about it. But we should at least be able to face it. I mean, these are some of the most elementary truths about history in the current era. Yeah.
You spoke somewhat favorably initially about free flow of labor as opposed to free flow of capital, and then later on seemed to retract that. And I just wondered how you felt. Yeah, that's a comment. What it was. So you verbally about the free flow of.
Well, it's not a matter of whether I do. If anybody believes in free markets, that was a good question about whether we should believe in free markets. Kind of an academic question, because nobody believes in them except for somebody else. So like Britain believed in free markets for India, not for itself. Developmental state of the usual kind. Same everywhere. But you could, in like an academic seminar, decide whether we really think that free markets are a good idea. Okay? And if we do, the first thing we should recognize is exactly what Adam Smith recognized: that the core principle of free markets is what he called free circulation of labor. If you don't think that's right, then abandon the pretenses about free markets and say what you do think. Personally, I don't think that free markets are a viable system. If you really, Adam Smith had an argument, and it's a serious argument, and you should look at it, but I don't think it worked. First of all, he wasn't really a believer in free markets. He had a very nuanced approach to it. But his basic argument, 10 of part 1, if I remember, is something like that, was that what he said, the way he put it is, under conditions of perfect equality, of perfect freedom, perfect liberty, under conditions of perfect liberty, free markets will lead to perfect equality. In fact, that was his main moral argument. And he, like other classical liberals, took equality to be a value in itself, desideratum. Something goes back to Aristotle. I don't think his argument works, but anyway, that was the argument. And you can ask whether you think that's right. Actually, if you think about markets, there's very good reasons why no country that had any control or group that had any power would ever be willing to accept them. And the reason is they have built-in properties which lead to rapid self-destruction. A lot of these are things that we're facing. We have kind of limited market system, very limited. But to the extent that they function, these properties show up. So just imagine the way a market's supposed to work. The way a market's supposed to work, the participants in the market, vote with their dollar. Like you got $10, you get 10 votes in the market. Essentially the idea. And then it's supposed to all work out magically that everybody's happy. But one consequence of this, elementary consequence, is that people who have no dollar have no vote. Well, there are plenty of people who don't have any votes in the market. For example, your children and grandchildren, because they're not alive. I mean, people who aren't alive, by definition, have no votes in the market. So therefore, the market does not respond to their concern. Okay, therefore, if the market really functions, it wipes out the species very quickly. Okay, because those who have to face the costs of what is done are not around to contribute a vote. Well, that's just at the beginning. If we look further, there are a lot of other problems. For example, there are the problems about specialization that I mentioned. Pursuit of comparative advantage, it's not Smith, that's Ricardo, does lead to specialization. That's what it's intended to do. Specialization means loss of choices, including choice of changing comparative advantage, which is called development. That's one of the consequences of pursuing that regime. And it has exactly the problems on an international scale that Adam Smith pointed out on a domestic scale when he criticized specialization that follows from division of labor. These aren't deep points, and they're just the bare beginning. But they're among the reasons why people should be very suspicious about this ideology. And in fact, those who have any power are so suspicious that they never admit it. I think it's unthinkable. I mean, the rich and the powerful demand a very powerful state to protect them. They always have. Want to have an example? Have a look at on the plane up this morning. I was reading Financial Times, major premier business journal. They have a pretty good op-ed by someone reviewing the recent behavior of the IMF, and he points out, it's not a novel point, that the function of the IMF is to provide free risk insurance to investors. That's what it is. So if you want to invest in a risky investment, you'll get a lot of high yield because it's risky. You're perfectly happy that the rich investor, bank or whatever, to take the profits. But if anything goes wrong, somebody else has to pay. Like nobody believes in the capitalist principle. The capitalist principle is that if I lend you money and you can't pay back, it's your responsibility to pay, and it's my problem if you don't. Well, certainly no rich person is going to accept that. If you lend money to somebody with high yield because it's risky, and something goes wrong, then you don't pay. Rather, the IMF comes in and carries out what's called a bailout of the country, which is in fact a bailout of the investors. Namely, it socializes the costs of the risks. It socializes the costs the public pays, and the risk and the targets are even worse. Like the guys who borrowed the money, they don't have to pay. They don't have to pay it back. It's the poor people in their neighborhood who pay it back. Right? Like when somebody lends money to Indonesia, let's say, makes a ton of money, and then Indonesia defaults on its debt. Did the guys who borrowed the money pay it back? The Indonesian debt, which I think was around $80 billion, was held by maybe 200 people. They don't pay it back. They send their money off to banks in New York, or probably never left there. The guys who pay it back are the poor population of Indonesia. They didn't borrow the money. So nobody believes in the elementary capitalist principle because it's harmful to the rich. What you believe is particular versions of it which are beneficial to the rich and harmful to everyone else. It's not very surprising. Like Adam Smith said, the principal architects of policy are going to ensure that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to, and they will follow the vile maxim of the master, all for ourselves and nothing for anyone else. But you expect anything different? What did you hear what he said? Why did the liberal intelligentsia in the United States, who are you referring to? In the United States and the country support a two-state settlement and the business community in Israel and Palestine? It's like asking why they decided to give away their money and live lives of poverty. Never happened. Can't answer it. Never happened. They've always opposed it. They still oppose it. The United States, for another thing that isn't discussed much, but if you bother to look, you'll find that for the last 30 years, the United States has stood essentially alone in the real international community. They talk about, but the world, in blocking any kind of political settlement. It's been going on since 1971. Israel's the same story. What they call a settlement is one that breaks the occupied territories into several cantons, which are, including the latest Clinton plan. Just take a look at the maps. There's a reason why the maps are never presented here. You take a look at the maps, which you can find in Israel or elsewhere. The most forthcoming plans include Israeli salients that break the West Bank into two parts, east of Jerusalem, actually bisected, and another salient that breaks it further north. And of course, it's all separated from the Gaza Strip, and probably that's going to be split up too. Kind of a Bantustan settlement. Yeah, in fact, there could have been, there was a call for a political settlement, very explicit back in the mid-70s, which had overwhelming international support. The U.S. had to veto it at the Security Council. That pretty much remains true, except that by now most of the world has accepted the fact that the U.S. is just going to run this area by force, backed off. But not so.